Our next guest will be holding a press conference at the APEC Business Summit later today on strategies for a global consensus on climate change. Alan Oxley is chairman of NGO World Growth, and he joins us live in Sydney. Alan, it's a pleasure to see you once again on our show. As I just mentioned, it seems as if a lot of the APEC leaders have different agendas and different purposes when it comes to climate change. How do you propose they find a unified ground on that?
Well, if you string together what they've all said, we can construct a new approach. The G8 leaders decided in June that Kyoto wasn't working and a new approach had to be adopted. Chinese president said that had to be done in the UN framework. President Bush went along with that as well. So what we're seeing here is the beginning of the much-needed development of a new consensus. When you talk about consensus, when you talk about a new approach, do you have any particular proposal that you think might actually work? Yes, well, we analysed this. Following the G8 summit, we thought some thinking needed to be done. Some mistakes were made with Kyoto, which I think were to be avoided. So we produced a report which analyses really why Kyoto didn't work. First reason is that it carried a cost to growth which developing countries simply wouldn't wear. If you might remember this report by British economist Sir Nicholas Stern, he said we could take 1% off world growth to meet these Kyoto targets that he set, tough ones. Well, we've calculated that would mean a loss of 15% to the Chinese economy, 12% to the Indian economy, 12% to ASEAN economies. That's a cost countries won't bear. What we think can be done is you develop a strategy where each country lays out a way to deal with climate change and greenhouse emissions which best suits its economy. Important thing we have to remember here, this is long term. We're looking at 100, 150-year strategy. So frankly, there's no rush, and getting it right at the beginning is vital. Do you think that there's any particular country in our region that needs to take the lead on this? I mean, obviously some people are saying that Australia, having never signed the Kyoto Protocol, is not particularly in a position to be leading APEC-wide emissions cuts. But nonetheless, when we listened to Bush earlier on our show, he was saying that India and China need to be part of the process. He seems to be really pointing to those countries. My job here is not to defend the Australian government. To be fair to them, they didn't sign Kyoto, but they're going to meet the targets, which is what half the Europeans who signed it won't. What you've got here in APEC are the 3 or 4 big countries, the world's biggest emitters that you have to have signed on if you're going to have a global strategy. And that's the United States, China and Japan. That's an excellent start. So I think Australia's role in hosting this meeting is to bring them together, but those countries have to come together to make this work. So bottom line, Alan, are you hopeful that there will be some concrete outcome in Sydney this weekend? Well, I'm hopeful that we get an outcome which will mean people will continue to talk. That's really important. Challenging countries to say, support this approach, support that approach, is not the way to build a consensus. First thing to do is get them together and start talking. I think that's what we look forward to, and I believe we will get that, yes. Alan, what kind of platform do you think has been established in APEC for throwing it forward for the talks that President Bush wants to convene later on this month in Washington with some of the big economies to tackle further this global issue of climate change? Well, they started something 2 years ago. It was announced at the ASEAN summit in Laos, and they formed China, Korea, Australia, Japan, and they included India. Set out what they call the Asia-Pacific Partnership, and rather than setting targets to reduce emissions, they decided to collaborate to identify technologies and processes that could enable them to reduce emissions. Let me give you a simple example. If China were, by some magic sweep of the wand, able today to replace its power-generating equipment for its electricity with modern technology, the sort of technology used in Japan, its emissions would halve. Now, this is a very practical approach, and we've already got a basis for this sort of cooperation among the Asian Pacific economies, so they can build on it. In the UN now, Ban, the new Secretary General, has put out a strategy for building a new consensus, and in it he's included technology. So I think we're already seeing the basis of a broader approach to addressing climate change than the rather narrow, mandatory reductions on targets that we saw in Kyoto. Alan, when you listen to the concerns expressed, especially by some of the developing economies in this region, China and India, for instance, you mentioned earlier, their worry is that, look, if you restrict energy use and try to bring it into line with protocols, etc., then that's going to have a knock-on effect on their economic growth. How do you address, or how are delegates addressing that very real concern? Well, it's a reality that must be taken into account, and it's again one of the reasons that Kyoto couldn't work. just achieving cuts between 1990 and 2012 of 7% in emissions. That's what Kyoto thought. China wouldn't and couldn't do that. China's been very frank. It will increase its emissions because it needs more power to raise its standards of living. I mean, we must remember that between China and India, there's over 1 billion people in both countries still living on less than $1 a day. That's why I think we need different strategies. If the Europeans want to put in mandatory cuts and cut emissions that way by setting targets, let them. But for countries like India and China, we've got to have different strategies where they can make contributions, for example, by introducing more efficient means of generating power. They'll still increase emissions, but they'll certainly increase them at a slower pace. And the important thing still to remember here is that we're looking at 100-year strategies. So we've got plenty of time for much later on countries, once they've raised their standards of living, to start to take some rather more dramatic action.
One of the other topics that is, of course, on the agenda at the APEC summit is trade talks, notably the Doha round of trade talks, and getting that back on track. Alan, you are pro-globalization, and I did read in an article that you believe the principal responsibility of the failure in the Doha trade talks so far lies with the EU. Can you expand on that and whether or not you think that we can get some kind of breakthrough this weekend? Alan,
I lost
can you
the
hear
sound
us?
on that question, but I think it was about the trade talks.
Correct. And that you believe... Sorry, please go on.
The leaders, I don't think, can do much about the Doha round. I mean, the key party for this is the European Union. It's not at the table. President Bush has said that he still favours developing the idea of a regional free trade agreement among the APEC countries. I think that's a 10-year project. But I think what we're going to see here in APEC is a bit of a shift. They'll say, let's do something about Doha. I think they know they can't do much. And I think over time we're going to see a greater focus on more regional trade liberalisation.
Alan, thank you very much for telling it to us straight. Alan Oxley, Chairman of NGO World Growth, live at the APEC Summit in Sydney.